Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Xauen, and as always, I'm pleased that you decided to spend a little bit of your time today listening to me talk about military history. Today we're going to continue with the story of the Rif War, the vicious colonial conflict that was fought in the 1920s in the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco. Last time we finished up with the first phase of the conflict, that ending with the fall of the Spanish Restoration system and the rise of the Primo de Rivera dictatorship. The coming of this strong man to the helm of the Spanish ship of state brought about a change in the character of the bloody struggle, but did little to mitigate the ferocious and ruthless nature of the combat involved. My sources for this one will be the same three books as I've been using for the rest of the series. These are Rebels in the Rif by David Woolman, The Betrothed of Death by Jose Alvarez, and Primo de Rivera and Abdel Krim, a dissertation by Shannon Fleming. So with that said, let's go back to Spain in the summer of 1923, where stalemate in the Protectorate and radical instability at home were combining to bring about the downfall of the constitutional system that had prevailed there since the 1870s. As we noted in the previous episode, the Spanish government in the last days of 1922 was headed by the liberal Garcia Prieto. This government was carrying out policies that reflected the enormous opposition to the war in Morocco, and above all to the conscription that it involved. These measures were certain to antagonize the more aggressive and militant portions of the army, the Africanistas. Two specific moves of this government in particular infuriated this dangerous element of the officer corps: the ransom of the Spanish prisoners taken by the Riffians after Anwal, which they viewed as an intolerable and dangerous humiliation, and the appointment of the first civilian high commissioner to lead the colonial administration, which up to now had been in the hands of a military man. The man who would hold this post was Don Miguel Civella, who had very little knowledge of the Protectorate, the war being fought there, or colonial administration in general. This new High Commissioner stepped into a situation that saw Spain's cause at a low ebb. In the Western Theater, Spanish victory against El Razuli, which had been virtually certain, had been forfeited in favor of a negotiated settlement which left the all-but defeated Eagle Janat free to rebuild his power in the Jebala, while tying Spain's hands in the area. In the East, formidable Riffian Harkas and Spanish army were stalemated along a line near the foothills of the mountains of the Central Rif. Though both sides were much stronger than they had been the previous year, none could force a decision. The Riffians, despite repeated attempts, were unable to break the Spanish line and trigger another disaster of the kind that had followed Anwal. This was really their only hope to bring the war to a favorable conclusion, as another such defeat would have extremely negative effects on the already waning Spanish will to fight. For their part, the Spanish were equally unable to advance into the Rif, or to move in safety practically anywhere outside of their fortifications. This cut them off from the only hope of bringing about the submission of the rebels, the occupation of the territory of the central Riffian tribes, in particular the Beni Arguel, strongest and that of the Abdel Krim brothers and their chief supporters. They were now quite secure in their home territory, so much so that on the 1st of February 1923, Abdel Krim had himself formally proclaimed Emir, or Prince of the Rif, and all the territory that his forces controlled. One response to the new Civilla administration to the stalemate in the east was to attempt to negotiate a settlement with the Riffians. For this purpose, the new government in Madrid sent Santiago Alba, the Secretary for Moroccan Affairs, to Melilla to try and reach an arrangement through a Riffian intermediary named Driss Ben Said, longtime friend of Abdel Krim. This attempt to bring the war to an end by private agreements reached among the principals enraged the Africanista element of the army, who felt that, like the other conciliatory measures taken by the Prieto government, it reflected a lack of confidence in their ability to bring the war to a victorious conclusion. This was probably an accurate assessment of the government's motives, but the collective pride of these officers was unable to accept this fact. In order to nullify the effect of Santiago's effort, the military brought General Martinez Anidio out of retirement and placed him in command of the Eastern Commandancia. This man, who would go on to hold critical positions in the Primo de Rivera and Franco regime's internal security services, was deeply hated for his extraordinarily harsh repression of the anarcho-syndicalists and other dissident groups in Catalonia. Not long after this sinister figure took charge, Driss Ben Said was mysteriously murdered, and without this vital contact the peace effort was critically undermined. And so the stalemate went on. In mid-May, the Spanish began a series of small advances in the east, first of which was carried out by the 4th Bandera of the Tercio on the 16th, when they led a force that took the position of Peña Tojarda. Spaniards encountered minimal resistance here, but nonetheless the commander of the 4th Bandera, Major Felipe Figueres, was badly wounded in the attack. On the 20th, this same force joined a column under Colonel Coronel, which marched to a place called Tifarun, between the old Anwal battlefield and the coastal fortress at Fraught. Built a strong point there, as well as an outpost on the nearby peak known as Farah. In the meantime, the Riffians had begun preparations for a renewed assault on the Spanish line, and by the last days in May had surrounded the critical Spanish fortress of Tiziata and put it under blockade and siege. For the remainder of the month, the fighting here reproduced the pattern that had become familiar in the early years of the Rif War. Spanish fortifications were critically dependent on regular deliveries of water and other supplies, and as a result, they were compelled to run repeated convoys through the Riffian-controlled countryside. This resulted in repeated small actions fought between the besieging rebels and the escorts of the supply convoys. These escorts were made up, as the fighting vanguard of the Spanish army in Africa usually was, of battalion and company-sized units of the Tercio, Regulares, and occasionally the paramilitary police loyal to the Moroccan Sultan, the so-called Mehala, were often lent to the Spanish for particular operations. The posts in the immediate area of Tiziasa, namely Benitez, Tifarun, Tafarsit, and Teruel, as well as the main base itself, were completely dependent on the success of these convoys. Usually, the Riffians would retreat from strong counterattack and therefore rarely stop the convoys from getting through, though they would always inflict numerous casualties from ambushes and delaying actions fought in numerous ravines and narrow valleys of the area. The Spanish columns, once they had delivered their supplies, would withdraw, and the units involved dispersed back to their base camps. Almost immediately after their departure, the temporarily scattered Riffians would surround the fortifications once more, necessitating yet another costly supply mission. This pattern would be continued as summer approached, costing both sides heavily in men and the Spanish heavily in equipment lost to the rebels. As we had noticed previously, each of these numerous small actions would net the Riffians a bonus in weapons and equipment captured from the Spaniards or taken off their dead. In this way, these inconclusive actions worked more heavily against the Spanish. Though neither side was able to accomplish their immediate strategic aims, if the pattern was continued long enough, the will to fight would be broken on one side or the other. This was a bigger problem for Spain, for whom the war was extremely expensive and politically destabilizing. The Riffians, however, were not immune to war weariness, and the coalition of tribes that the Abdel Krims had welded together after Anwar was very fragile, and could only be held together by continued victory or by the harsh repression of dissenters. The Riffians made a strong attempt to break the stalemate in June, launching a series of intense attacks on the major stronghold at Tiziata. This position was the key to the Spanish system in the east, and its fall was their best hope of rolling up the rest of the Spanish network and triggering another collapse. The Spanish defense was tenacious, and was composed of the usual mix of conscript riflemen holding the fortifications, supported by mobile forces composed of the Legion and the Regulares. A novelty of this year was the availability of support from the planes of the Spanish Air Force. The small numbers and relatively low performance of these aircraft made this support less effective than it might have been, however, and the skillful Riffian guerrillas made clever use of the terrain to nullify most of the effects of the bombing and strafing. A few of the planes were even brought down by Riffian small arms fire, including one piloted by Major Alfredo Candelan. This man, who would go on to become the chief of the Spanish Air Force under Franco during the Civil War, crash-landed in contested territory, but managed to escape capture and make his way back to the Spanish line. Once again, the situation at Tiziata was saved by the troops of Tercio, led this time by Lieutenant Colonel Rafael Valenzuela, who had replaced Milan Estrella after the former chief and founder of the Legion had resigned. On the 4th, a particularly strong effort was launched against the Spanish defense, and this new commander led the 2nd Bandera of the Legion, who were counterattacking the Riffians dug in on the slopes leading up to the fortress along with 2 other banderas. At the critical point in the brutal back-and-forth struggle that broke out on the hillside, this man ordered the bugler to blow the rallying call from the Legion, which translates to, "Legionaries, to fight! Legionaries, to die!" Drew his soldiers up and told them, "Legionaries, the moment has come to die for Spain," and led them in a bayonet charge into the Riffian entrenchments. In the typical fashion of the Tercio, they drove the rebels from their position with cold steel and hand grenades, and a vicious struggle fought at point-blank range. In the classic style of command of this aggressive unit, Valenzuela charged at the head of his men, shouting commands, waving his chapiri or service cap, firing a sidearm into the rebel position. Before he got very far, he was shot twice almost simultaneously, once in the head and then once in the chest, fell, as did those around him and the stretcher bearers that rushed out to retrieve his body. His men rushed forward and in brutal close-quarters fighting pushed the attackers back, routed them off the hillside, and broke this, their final effort. Valenzuela's iconic death in the battle at the head of his men cemented his place in the Legion's growing mythology, cleared the way for the promotion of Francisco Franco, Milan Estrella's protege and the de facto commander of the Legion, to officially take charge of this elite formation. Valenzuela's death was far from the only one that bloody day, however. More than 197 Spaniards were made casualties in this action, a number that amounts to almost 40% of the nominal strength of one of the Legion's banderas. Riffian losses are unknown, but were certainly on this scale or higher. After the Riffian June offensive petered out, Abdelkrim dispatched delegates to Melilla to try to obtain a ceasefire. This move was not taken out of any necessity on the part of the Riffians. Prince of the Rift's position was just as secure after the Tiziata actions as before. Instead, the hope was that the Spanish would take the opportunity to roll back their commitments in the territory, or, as the Bananista element of the army and most of the wider Spanish population wished, to leave Morocco altogether. Negotiations took place between the representatives of the two sides aboard a ship anchored in Alhucemas Bay, not far off the coast of Abdelkrim's capital at Axdir. Meetings as well as exchanges of notes and letters went on for about a month. No agreement was reached as the Spanish, while willing to grant a degree of autonomy to the Riffians within the framework of the Protectorate, were not prepared to consider Riffian independence, and the Riffians were unwilling to consider a settlement on any other basis. Around this time, another set of negotiations were going on, this time between the European powers over the status of the internationally governed city of Tangier. The principal powers involved were France, Britain, and Spain. Three powers advocated different solutions to the problem of the control of the strategically located city and its immediate hinterland. The Spanish delegation argued for the inclusion of the 147 square miles in question into Spanish Morocco. The French held out for a French protectorate, while the British, with their strong interest in denying controls of the Straits to any single power, put forward a plan for full internationalization. This was adopted with the support of the Spanish party, who preferred this to the French option. Statute of Internationalization was formally adopted in December of 1923 and created a governing body representing Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, and the Moroccan Sultan. The defeat of the French plan for control of the city was mitigated somewhat by this arrangement. Since the Sultan was in reality the creature of France, this effectively gave the French 2 votes on the council. This government would not actually be installed until 18 months later, however, in June 1925. Spain gained little from this new arrangement. The mountains in the vicinity, the springs of which supplied the Spanish with fresh water, were officially incorporated into Spanish territory, and the Spanish consul in Tangier gained the right to expel from the city any Moroccan born in the Protectorate. Little effect was noted on the ease with which arms were purchased by Riffian agents and smuggled into the Spanish territory, however, and Tangier continued to constitute a large hole in the Spanish blockade of the Rif. So the military stalemate continued without apparent hope for a solution. The Africanista element of the army, prodded by a frustrated Spanish government to come up with a realistic plan for victory, was in the process of reorganizing the Spanish lines of defense in the east when a strong new offensive was launched from the Rif in the third week of August. This attack came through the same area in which the actions were fought in May and June. This time, the major battle centered on a strong Spanish convoy moving to supply the critical base at Tiziata, as well as several small posts in the area. Abdelkrim's Harkas struck in the vicinity of the post of Tifarun. Something like 9,000 Riffians attacked the Spanish here, who drove them off in a desperate battle which saw them kill more than 600 of the attackers. The Spanish were also badly hurt in this defensive action, which was reported, and is still remembered sometimes now, as a significant victory. Nonetheless, in the course of the long battle, the convoy was halted, and the escorting troops unable to break through to the embattled garrisons, and compelled to withdraw back to their base at Dar Kebdani. The focus of the battle then shifted to the siege of Tifarun, and Spanish efforts to break it. For 3 days, between the 19th and 21st of August, heavy combat surrounded the little fortress here. While the defenders broiled in the hot August sun and exchanged gunfire with the Riffians, Franco arrived on the scene to direct operations. The next day, the Spanish drew up forces for a strong attack to break the Riffian siege once and for all. This was to involve a strong flanking action by 2 Tavors of Regulares, while the enemy was held by a frontal attack by the 2 banderas of the Legion. Instead, Franco came up with a plan that sent the Regulares in to carry out a diversionary attack while the Tercio made a long march to catch them from the rear, assisted by a surprise landing of Spanish Marines from the sea. This maneuver worked perfectly, and caught the stunned besiegers in a sudden crossfire that disorganized their defense. The Legion then closed in and decimated them in hand-to-hand fighting. This attack was unusual for the tactical complexity it involved, but this paid off in relatively light Spanish casualties. The Riffians, on the other hand, were said to have left countless bodies on the field, as well as a large amount of equipment. This unusually decisive defeat put an end to their summer offensive. On On the same day, August 22nd, mutinies broke out among draftee soldiers headed for the Protectorate. Riots erupted in the ports of Malaga and at Barcelona, and when the army moved in to restore order, they found their efforts opposed by the Spanish government, who sided with the popular feeling against the war and its necessary conscription. The man held responsible for the mutiny in Malaga, a Corporal José Sanchez Barroso, was sentenced to death, but this was annulled by the government. For the next 2 weeks, disorders and civil conflicts raged throughout the country, while the government and army squared off against one another. The name of the man who would step onto the scene and bring about the necessary changes in the Spanish state was Don Miguel Primo de Rivera. He had been born in Andalusia at Jerez de la Frontera in 1870. He came from an influential family and had been in the army since the age of 14. His experience in Morocco dated from 1893, when he fought as a lieutenant in the campaign of that year. In this short conflict, he performed a notable feat of arms by single-handedly taking back a Spanish cannon from the enemy, who had captured it just moments before. These and other meritorious actions earned him the Cross of San Fernando and a promotion to captain. After this, he went to Cuba and then the Philippines, and was back in Morocco in 1911, fighting in the valley of the River Kurt. There, he was gravely wounded in action and forced to abandon active service for a time. Nevertheless, he rose to Major General by 1913, and during the First World War was posted as an observer with the French army on the Western Front. Upon his return to Spain, he took up the post of Captain General of Cadiz. This post was a combination of military administrator and civil governor, and one of the highest positions a Spanish officer could hold under the Spanish state organization at the time. It was while performing these duties that he first earned the ire of the militant Africanista element of the army, when in 1917 he publicly criticized their conduct of affairs in the Protectorate and suggested that the Presidio of Ceuta, or some other portion of Spanish Morocco, should be traded to England in exchange for the return of Gibraltar. This was an idea he would advocate several times in succeeding years, along with expressing his frustration at what he considered the purposeless waste of Spanish lives and treasure in the territory. This cost him his position as Captain General, but did little to impede his promotion, as not long after he was promoted again and appointed to the very prestigious post of Commander of the 1st Infantry, stationed at Madrid. This failed to satisfy his ambition, however, and in 1921 he ran for elected office in Cadiz, and was elected that city's senator in the Cortes, the Spanish legislature. Here he continued to speak out against army policy in the colony, and for this he was expelled from the Cortes. However, he was immediately offered the even more influential post of Captain General of Barcelona, making him perhaps the most important Spanish military man in the peninsula. This post was given him for 2 reasons. 1. It was hoped that as a popular and forthright officer he would be able to put an end to the persistent civil disorders in the Catalonian province, connected with the growing Catalan Separatist movement and the conscription for the Moroccan War. Catalan Separatism, like the similar Basque and Galician movements, was a major concern of the Africanista element of the army, who viewed one of their principal duties as the maintenance of the integrity of the Spanish state. His enemies hoped that this would also erode his popularity, as the measures necessary to end the troubles here would almost certainly be repressive and extremely unpopular. And indeed, his handling of the situation did achieve quick results, but only by the imposition of severe restrictions on the Catalan dissidents. In the course of his performance of these duties in Barcelona, which were carried out against the background of widespread and mounting destabilization of the Spanish political system, Primo de Rivera, like many others, became convinced that the incompetence of the civil leadership was to blame for this dire situation. Intervention by the army in political life in such situations had become a relatively common feature of Spanish history in the 19th century, when in so-called pronunciamientos the army would step in, kick out a government they considered dysfunctional, carry out some necessary reforms, and then withdraw to allow the new system to function. This was a result of the change in the ethos of the army following the loss of the Latin American colonies and other foreign defense commitments, in which the officers saw themselves chiefly as the appointed guardians of the patrimony and honor of the nation, whatever the transitory civil government may decide. It's not unexpected, then, that plotting was already underway in the troubled year of 1923, when a junta of high-ranking officers, with the tacit consent of King Alfonso, were already moving behind the scenes. And despite his abandonista opinions, Primo de Rivera was a natural man to consider for the role of leader of this planned coup. His popularity, as well as his very abandonista stance, made him likely to garner support among the people, and when contacted by General Cavalcante, the leader of the conspiracy, he was able to win them to his support by promising an honorable solution to the Moroccan problem rather than a humiliating and degrading capitulation. On the 12th of September, Primo de Rivera committed himself, and issued a manifesto to the Spanish nation swearing himself to liberate the country from the yoke of the leadership which was, in his words, quote, responsible for the last 25 years of national misfortune and corruption. The king, who was not coincidentally away from Madrid on vacation at this time, was reassured by the lack of violent reaction to this proclamation and returned to Madrid on the 15th. On that day, he invited Primo de Rivera to take over the Spanish government, and the general accepted. The constitutional system, known as the Canovite or the Restoration system, was set aside, and in its place the new dictator appointed a military directorate composed of 8 brigadier generals and 1 admiral. There was opposition to this coup, but nothing very serious, as the old regime had few supporters and the major players in the Spanish political scene, such as the church, the capitalists, the landowners, and the great majority of the officer corps were behind him. Without much regret and hardly any bloodshed, Spain shed the two-party system that had stood in the way of increasingly necessary reforms since its institution in 1875. The new strongman was not an evil or even an unlikable man. 53 years old, with white hair and a neat mustache, he was physically stout and of moderate height, and possessed a frank and open personality. Despite the enmity and jealousy his rise had provoked in some quarters, he had many more friends than enemies and had earned a reputation for courage and honesty. His essentially down-to-earth and relatable nature were well summarized in a popular bit of rhyme that was current at the time, which translates to, quote, a bottle, some cards, and a beautiful dame mark the coat of arms of our dear Primo's name. As dictator, he continued to project this apparently genuinely hearty image. He loved to mix with the people of Madrid, and can often be found engaged in animated conversation in some cafe until the wee hours of the morning. He had an unlimited confidence in his own good intentions, and while he was of course a military dictator, and therefore not exactly the type of person I would wish to praise, his rule was not cruel and by and large beneficent. However, he did impose severe restrictions on the Spanish people in order to bring an end to the civil disorders racking the country. Restrictions were placed on the press, and public assemblies and demonstrations of all kinds were forbidden. In regards to the situation in the Protectorate, Primo de Rivera sought to fulfill his promise to bring the war there to an end with the kind of honorable settlement that would be acceptable to the Africanistas. As a result, his earlier ideas of reducing Spanish commitments in the territory or leaving it altogether went out the window. A number of practical measures were instituted immediately after his accession that strengthened the army's position there. For the first time in regards to the Moroccan conflict, the country was declared to be in an official state of war. The corps of non-commissioned officers, which is a critical component in the fighting efficiency of a modern army, was enlarged and their pay increased. A budget of 54 million pesetas, or about 8 million contemporary dollars, was earmarked to build critically necessary infrastructure in the colony, mainly roads and railroads. The civilian high commissioner was relieved and replaced by a veteran of the Moroccan War. In addition, a reserve corps was created in Spain to rapidly reinforce the Army of Africa when necessary. This consisted of picked units stationed at the ports of Almeria and Alicante on the southeastern coast, ready to sail for the opposite coast of Africa at a moment's notice. The new regime began quickly to move to deal with the threats in the different portions of the Protectorate. In the west, the new High Commissioner was directed to resume negotiations with Raizuli, and the two met at Sidi Driss in October. The wily warlord welcomed the rise of the new dictator, pursued his regular policy of persuading the Spanish to allow him to act as their agent in the region of the Jebala. The new dictator had enough experience of Raizuli to realize how unreliable he would be in this role. Moreover, he knew that the French, who suspected Raizuli of cooperation with the Germans to smuggle weapons into their own Moroccan zone during the recent World War, would look poorly on any restoration of the war. During the course of the inconclusive meetings, Raizuli gave voice to the feelings of many of his Moroccan brethren about the gradual encroachment of imperial rule on their way of life, when he told a group of Spanish officers, quote, you give a man safety, but you take away hope. In the old days, anything was possible. There was no limit to what a man might become. The slave may become a minister or a general, and the scribe a sultan. Now a man's life is safe, but he is forever chained to his labor and his poverty. This sentiment may have been echoed by people all over the world whose ways of life were being subsumed by the spread of the Western liberal capitalist order at this time. In the end, the Spanish left the negotiating table having promised nothing. This was a relative defeat for Raizuli, and strengthened the Spanish position against him by eroding his prestige. This small indicator gave hope that the Spanish position in the Protectorate was not as hopeless as was thought. However, an incident had occurred during this period which illustrated how tenuous their control here really was. On the 22nd of August, the same day as the mutinies in Spain and the final defeat of the Riffian attack on Xiaowen, a small group of rebels entered the African territorial capital of Tetuan in regular civilian garb. These men proceeded to the square of one of the main streets of the town and produced rifles, and began firing into the crowd. Panic ensued among the horrified Tetuanis, 8 of whom were killed and another 20 wounded. In the ensuing chaos, every one of the raiders escaped unmolested. This terrible blow right in the heart of Spanish power in Morocco cast doubt on the power of the Spanish to hold the colony. Evidently, the rebels could move and kill with complete impunity. As 1924 began, winter brought cold temperatures and heavy rains that curtailed operations in the usual way. Nevertheless, the rebels mounted a major effort in a different direction, this time towards the west, away from the bloody impasse along the Amarkran foothills. The focus of the war would shift here and intensify throughout the year. The blow was struck not far from the Mediterranean coast at the post of Emter, situated in the rocky highlands and cedar forests of the Gomara. Strong Riffian forces attacked and put the fortress under siege. The Spanish Air Force deployed 2-seater biplane bombers in persistent attacks against the tribesmen, and reinforcements were sent by sea from Ceuta. But even so, the hard-pressed Spanish, which were caught off guard in this normally quiet sector, were forced to engage in a terrible month-long struggle to finally repel this assault. Riffian artillery once again showed its effectiveness, when on the 3rd of March gunners concealed in the coastal heights opened fire on the armored cruiser Catalunya. This ship, which had arrived to provide fire support to the garrison with its 2 9.4-inch and 8 5.5-inch guns, was hit repeatedly, killing part of her crew and forcing her to return to Spain to repair her damage. This attack was followed by a renewed assault on Tiziasa in the first week of March. Supporting attacks were launched against the Frau, on the coast, and Midar, in the area of Melilla. Bad weather and persistent fog prevented the effective use of Spanish air and artillery to break up the attacks, and the fortifications were held in vicious close-range combat with heavy use of bayonet, grenade, and even the knife. Heavy losses were taken by both sides in these savage no-quarter actions, of the kind which had become so familiar in this war. Once again, however, their conclusion saw the strategic situation remain virtually unchanged. During this same time, an unusual offer was made to the Spanish that could have critically affected their fortunes in the Rif. Baron Peter Wrangel, who had lately led the White Russian army fighting against the new Bolshevik government in post-revolutionary Crimea, approached Primo de Rivera with a proposal to employ his soldiers, more than 100,000 of whom had escaped Russia with him, against the Moroccan rebels. The dictator refused this intriguing offer on the grounds that the Spanish constitution forbade the presence of foreign soldiers on Spanish territory. Given the dictator's recent dismissal of the Spanish constitutional system, it is more likely that the same Spanish pride that took umbrage at the conciliatory moves of the Civella administration opposed the humiliating possibility of the war being brought to a victorious conclusion by a foreign army. In any case, Wrangel was refused, and the spectacle of a powerful Russian expeditionary force in the Rif in 1924 was never to be realized. Major rebel pressure was building up in the valley of the Udlao, a river flowing through the eastern portion of the Gomara, to the north of the key town of Xiaowen. Here they were led by a man named Ahmed Herrero. This man, who was part of the Beni Hasmar tribe, had served with the Spanish Regulares based in Tetuan. He left the Spanish service and became, by 1923, one of the principal lieutenants of El Razuli. Slighted by the Eagle of Jinat in a matter of preference, this proud warrior deserted and offered his sword to Abd el-Krim. The Riffian leader was glad to take aboard a capable leader with a reputation for courage and valor among the fighting men of the West. The attack on Emter mentioned before in March was led by this man. The Riffians had been exerting themselves among the people of Raizuli's domain while his forces were prostrate, and Herrero would prove instrumental in their efforts here. Strangely, Raizuli made no move to punish this renegade, likely due to the warlord's rapidly deteriorating health. In May, the Riffians resumed the offensive, striking this time in 2 areas simultaneously, at Sidi Massoud near the Anwar battlefield and in a line of blockhouses built in the Udlao Valley. In the former area, the Spanish had brought a sizable force of armored cars to bear in order to protect their convoys, but the Riffians learned to counter these machines, as well as the rarer tanks used by the Spanish, by trapping them in wide trenches and showering them with grenades from above. In the Udlao sector, where the increased Spanish fortifications had alienated the local people, Harkas under Herrero were active and put the defenders under heavy pressure. The Spanish Air Force retaliated with bombing attacks on the villages in the area, which only hit non-combatants who had stayed behind. The combination of these factors resulted in the people of the area, the Beni Hasmar, Beni Said, and the Beni Hassan, to finally throw in with the Abd el-Krim in June. Fighting continued off and on in these areas throughout the summer, even though a series of unseasonable rains in August made movement difficult on the undeveloped tracks and trails of the region. On the 24th of July, Primo de Rivera arrived in the Protectorate and toured the Spanish defensive system from the Silvestre line through Tetuan and to La Roche in the far west. Before leaving for Morocco, he had resolved on a radical plan. Specifically, he envisioned the withdrawal of Spanish troops from most of the outlying areas and the maintenance of control through governors appointed by the Khalifa, who was the Moroccan puppet ruler in the Spanish territory. The most controversial part of this plan was the governors themselves, who were to be Raizuli in the west and Abdelkrim in the east. This was fiercely resented by the Africanistas and the officer corps, as well as by the portions of the Moroccan population who had remained loyal to Spain or even neutral in the struggle, who would surely be exposed to retaliation in the event of a Spanish withdrawal. Also, it seems unlikely that Abdelkrim would abandon his ambitions after his appointment, the withdrawal of Spanish troops from the tribal areas under his control, which all parties would regard as a major Riffian victory. Despite his earlier resolution against any action of this sort, Primo came around to the idea as the lesser of two evils available to him. Withdrawal from most of the present positions, under whatever circumstances, would in any case allow the Spanish to remove thousands of their men from useless positions of danger, send them to safe areas to reorganize and retrain for a new approach, and eventually return to the battlefield stronger. Talking about these plans to an American journalist, Webb Miller, Primo de Rivera was characteristically candid. Quote, "Abdelkrim has defeated us. He has the immense advantages of the terrain and a fanatical following. Our troops are sick of war, and they have been for years. They don't see why they should fight and die for a strip of worthless territory. I am withdrawing to this line, and will hold only the tip of the territory. I personally am in favor of withdrawing entirely from Africa and letting Abdelkrim have it. We have spent untold millions of pesetas in this enterprise, and have never made a centimo from it. We have had tens of thousands of men killed for territory which is not worth having." This kind of thinking lay behind the dictator's decision to withdraw from much of the territory, especially in the west. The intense opposition felt in the army against this policy was expressed to the dictator in the course of his tour of the Spanish army in the Protectorate. Characteristically, it was the men of the Tercio who let their ire be known. In a visit to the Legion base at Ben Tieb, in the hills behind Tiziazza, near the end of July, Primo de Rivera arrived for a banquet arranged by the officers of this elite unit. Every course of this meal was one form or another of eggs, which in Spanish slang of the time often indicated testicles. Remarking on this odd menu, the dictator was told that those who wished for withdrawal would have no further need for their eggs. Primo de Rivera took this deliberate, elaborate insult with remarkable calm. After a likely somewhat tense meal, Franco, the senior tercio officer present, made a speech in which he called on the dictator to not abandon the territory for which so many brave men had fallen in the last 2 years. He asserted that the present positions could be held indefinitely, and that, with reinforcements and a projected landing at Alhucemas Bay, his men and the rest of the army could bring the war to a victorious conclusion. The assembled officers received this with enthusiasm. The dictator then rose and made a reply of his own, where he outlined his plans for the territory, in a speech said to have been extremely frank and full of the kind of guts that these men admired. He discussed his reasons for withdrawal, and when he questioned the idea of the amphibious landing, the officers around the table openly booed and jeered him. Furious as this must have made him, he suppressed his anger and went on, as he could scarcely afford to alienate the best troops as his command. Nonetheless, he sternly pointed out that it was not the job of junior officers to decide state policy, reminded them of the Legion's code, the first rule of which was blind obedience, and concluded with, quote, "Now I talk to you in an informal way, but on the day when your orders are given to you, you have no choice but to obey them, whatever they may be." In response to this, Franco offered his resignation, stating that he did not believe he could honorably carry out Primo's plan. This is an example of the way in which Franco built his influence in the course of this conflict. Primo could not afford to be responsible for Franco's disappearance from the Tercio, where he was greatly respected and admired. As a result, Primo and Franco withdrew into a private conference later that night, a talk that lasted for hours. At the end of it, the dictator emerged with a modified plan, and Franco retained his post as the most important commander in the Protectorate, with the enhanced prestige of having faced down the dictator and caused him to accept his own point of view. Crucially, he appeared to all to have done this not out of anger or his own ambition, but out of a genuine concern for Spanish, and above all the Spanish soldiers' honor and integrity. This further cemented his image as the best representative of the Spanish military man, and was another step towards his rise as supreme power. Primo de Rivera's altered plan dropped the idea of abandonment of the line in the eastern commandancia facing the central rift. In the west, however, Where the Spanish defenses were much less complete and far harder to hold against determined attack, withdrawal would proceed. A line covering the area of Tetuan and Ceuta along with the hinterland facing Tangier, and running from there south to the border with the French zone, would be established. This line would be similar to that held by the Spanish in the last years of the 1910s, and be fortified in a systematic manner similar to that of the Silvestre line in the east, and would become known as the Primo Line or the Estella line, after the dictator's seigneurial title, the Duke of Estella. Behind this line, the Spanish army would reorganize and undertake enhanced training, incorporate replacements and reinforcements, and later resume its offensive. Many Spanish posts lay beyond the projected line, as well as the important town of Xiaowen, up to now the key position in the Gomara region in the entire western commandancia. A strategic withdrawal from this town and the surrounding posts would have to be undertaken, and this operation would be the major action in the Protectorate in 1924. As the summer progressed, the challenges facing the Spanish in the western regions all the way to Larache on the Atlantic coast became more and more severe. A particularly damaging blow was struck against the post of Chintafa, where a Spanish garrison was besieged during the summer. Relief columns were unable to drive the Moroccans from the area, and when the fort was on the point of falling, its commander, a lieutenant named Vicente San Jose, secured his place in Spanish military lore by burning down his post and dying in hand-to-hand combat with the victorious rebels along with the remainder of his garrison. Strong columns sent to their aid from the Lacus region arrived days later, only to find the burned remains of the post and its defenders. Another siege was prosecuted against the fortified villages of Tefar and Buharash, where the Harkas of the Samada and Al-Sarif tribes kept the Spanish under unrelenting assault for 41 days, and the men of the small post of Seria performed prodigies of endurance and valor by holding out for no less than 76 days. Throughout the entirety of the Jebala, the Gomara, and the Lacus, the Spanish were unsafe anywhere outside of rifle shot of their own installations, and the critical supply system necessary to maintain their network of forts and blockhouses was unable to function without exacting a severe cost in lives and equipment. Even then, as we have seen, it was unreliable. This left the Spanish garrisons in the commandancia, amounting to more than 25,000 men, in an extremely precarious situation. Preparations for withdrawal went ahead and were complete by the first week of September. The order went out, and the Spanish withdrawal in the west began. The coastal posts of Mentir and Udlao, fought over many times, were evacuated by sea and their garrisons taken to Ceuta on the 8th. All throughout the western commandancia, outlying posts were abandoned, and their men taken back to Tetuan, Ceuta, or Larache. The only major portion of the defensive network that remained was the town of Xiaowen itself, and the fortifications in its immediate area. 10,000 Spaniards were stationed in the town, with many more in the outlying posts. According to the withdrawal plan, these were to be concentrated at Xiaowen and then marched to Tetuan. This move was very dangerous given the high level of rebel activity in the country that these men would have to traverse, and so a supporting column under the overall command of the High Commissioner himself, General Aispuru, was assembled in Tetuan to march to their relief. The first phase of this was accomplished on the 19th of September when the columns under the command of General Castor Girona and Federico Berenguer, not to be confused with the former High Commissioner Damaso Berenguer, took the heights of Gorges, which overlooked the route that the Spanish would have to travel. They encountered only scattered resistance here, and the possession of this high ground meant that the Spanish secured control of the crucially important valley of the Beni Hassan. The rest of this relief force moved through the sector by the 23rd. Another column, under General Carrasco, moved to their support from the west, departing Larache around the same time, but this ran into obstinate resistance at Joko el Jamis, in the territory of the Beni Aros tribe, and was forced to turn back due to heavy casualties. The region west of Xauen had become too dangerous even for these kind of relatively strong Spanish forces, and the units in Larache were forced to remain there throughout the winter, unable to play any major role in the succor of the garrisons of the Gomara. The forces coming down from Tetuan were deployed in 3 columns, led by Castro Girona, Ovila, and Serrano respectively. One traveled over the mountains south of Gorges, another marched through the valley itself, while the third moved over the hillsides on the opposite, or western side of the valley. The 4th group of units was kept in reserve at Ben Karish under Berenguer. By the 28th, the army had reached a point roughly halfway between Tetuan and Xiaowen, at a hilltop settlement known as Zoco el Arba. 2 days later, the column under Serrano entered Xiaowen, and the rest arrived not long after. The majority of these remained in Xiaowen to secure the town against assault, while the garrisons of the outlying posts were brought in. Though the rebels refused any major actions, the Spanish were constantly under the threat of ambush, hit-and-run attacks, and sniping. As a result, Many of the missions to evacuate the blockhouses resulted in the Spaniards taking more casualties than the number of soldiers they brought back to Xiaowen. Rebel control of the country roundabout was so strong that even traffic on the main patrolled roads was exposed to serious danger. Primo de Rivera himself, having recently arrived in the operational area, was ambushed along with his staff at the reserve position at Bencarich, far into the Spanish rear area. He emerged unharmed, but not everyone else was so lucky. On the 1st of October, for example, the Spanish suffered a severe check when a convoy of 40 trucks on the way from Xiaowen back to Tetuan was attacked by rebels using artillery and machine guns, who succeeded in destroying most of them. For the next 6 weeks, the Spanish remained at Xiaowen, pulling in their garrisons and fending off repeated minor attacks, all of which actions were performed under constant enemy harassment. As October wore on, General Ives Peru was relieved of his overall command of the withdrawal. This was not due to any failure on his part, but was instead the result of the presence of the dictator in the operational area. Primo de Rivera felt that the Xiaowen operation, which had the potential to be another major disaster, and which was his idea, should be his direct responsibility, and the opprobrium attached to the operation not fall on the shoulders of a subordinate. The dictator thus took direct command of the forces arrayed in the Western Commandancia. He was right in his estimation of the unpopularity of the retreat in many quarters. The Africanistas among the officer corps were furious with the dictator for giving up the positions they had won in the Western Commandancia since the capture of the town by High Commissioner Damaso Berenguer in 1920. A plot was actually afoot to place the dictator and his staff under arrest and to remove him from power. The chief conspirators were Franco and another major player in the 1936 uprising, General Gonzalo Queipo Delano. Delano later abandoned the plan once he realized that the support for the attempt was primarily to be found among politically inexperienced junior officers. He also persuaded Franco that such a move was risky without more support among the senior officers, and was in any case unlikely to improve the military situation. So nothing came of this plot, which the dictator felt strong enough to ignore. Queipo Delano, however, perhaps concerned about the repercussions of his involvement in the conspiracy, asked to be given a combat post or to be relieved of duty. Primo de Rivera chose the second option and sent him back to Spain, where he imprisoned him for a month. Despite this potentially mutinous situation, the evacuation went ahead as planned. The exit from Xiaowen took place in the dead of night on 15th of November. Thousands of Spanish troops marched quietly out of the town and headed north through the valley of the Beni Hassan. Not a single shot was fired as they steadily made their way back up the Tetuan road. On the 18th, the vanguard of the huge column, led by Castro Llorona, reached Zoco el Arba, the halfway point. The bulk of the retreating troops, who numbered more than 40,000, were strung out along the road all the way back to Xiaowen. The last to leave were the seasoned veterans of the Tercio, with Franco in charge, finally left the town only at midnight on the 17th. Legionaries formed a strong rearguard, and as usual, assumed the posts of greatest danger. As they moved out, the rebels moved into the town, with their heads bowed and feet bare in the customary tokens of gratitude for victory. The Spanish made their way towards Zoco el Arba unmolested until the 19th, when the rebels, joined now by Riffians fighting under Herrero, struck all at once. The trigger was the onset of heavy winter rainstorms, which drenched the Spanish and transformed the roads into quagmires. The Jebalis and Riffians, now numbering more than 7,000, seized their chance and hit the retreating columns all along the road. Given the dispersal of the Spanish, this resolved itself into a number of isolated actions. At the head of the column, Castro Llorona with the advance guard fought their way through the enemy and managed to break through to the reserves, which were still holding Bencarich further down the valley. General Serrano's contingent was caught near the fort of Chiruta, lost more than 1,000 of their number in a series of short engagements. Another large group of Spaniards was hit near the post of Darkaba, squeezed between two enemy forces striking from either side of the valley. The survivors of the initial onslaught pulled their formations together and battled their way into Zoco el Arba, where they halted, exhausted with the effort of intense combat and hauling their equipment and cannon through the clinging mud. They were promptly shut up within the defenses and surrounded by the jubilant rebels. For 3 weeks they would remain here, under unrelenting attack by the rebels, hoping for the weather to change and allow them to resume the march and make the last leg back to Tetuan. The situation was dire, and the specter of another Anwar haunted every Spanish fighting man. Morale was dangerously low among the soldiers, and this was not improved by the fact that when the troops here finally began to move out from the fort, marched west down the hill, along the main road, they marched over ground which was still strewn with corpses and their own wrecked and abandoned equipment. A rare moment of mutual respect in this normally extremely brutal war was provided by the actions of a small contingent of armored cars that the Spanish used to cover the retreat. These were cut off by the Riffian Harkas and trapped. The 14 Spanish soldiers manning the 3 cars held out inside their oven-like machines without food, water, or a realistic chance of rescue. After 3 days of successful resistance, the surviving men were totally exhausted, and the Riffians allowed these brave men to surrender on honorable terms. The rebels stood to attention and expressed their admiration to the 4 unwounded and 2 wounded Spaniards who were taken into captivity. Abd el-Krim, hearing of the valor of these men, moved them to the top of the prisoner exchange list. Not many Spanish prisoners were taken in the retreat from Xiaowen, however, as most of the wounded or surrendered were simply killed. Poor Spanish practice continued to hamstring their efforts here. As noted in previous episodes, the individual installations making up the defensive network were critically dependent on resupply, especially of water. This and the breakdown of supply created by the retreat was used against them in various ways by the rebel guerrillas. For example, at a ford of the Wad Habana, a minor river, the thirst-stricken Spanish soldiers broke discipline and rushed to the stream, where they threw themselves onto their hands and knees and gulped down the water. Rebel riflemen waiting in ambush in the surrounding hills shot them down as they did so. The defensive posts along the route also shared the weaknesses of the rest of the defensive system. They uniformly lacked sufficient storage capacity for supplies to wait out a long siege. Even worse, many were very badly sited. The aforementioned posts of Darkaba and Sharuta provide good examples of this. Many of the Spanish blockhouses were built on hilltops, where they were far from supplies of fresh water, and hence the dependence on supply. These 2 posts were instead built close to fresh water sources, which meant that they were located at the foot of the surrounding hills. This attempt to alleviate the water problem critically compromised their defensibility, however. An attacker in possession of the heights overlooking them could fire directly into the forts from above. This was the exact situation which had proven the undoing of the base at Anwal, and it likewise doomed the Spanish soldiers holding these smaller posts. This repetition of such an obvious and critical error more than 2 years after the disaster illustrates one of the basic weaknesses of the Spanish army, an incompetent, rigid, and unimaginative officer corps which relied far too much on guts and courage rather than tactical skill and material advantages to win the day, and proved unable to adapt methods to conditions. The retreat from Xiaowen would be the last campaign in which the Spanish would make the same kind of errors as Silvestra's ill-starred army had in 1921. After this harrowing experience, a more realistic, somewhat more professional approach would emerge. Spanish finally fought their way into Tetuan on the 13th of December, a month after they had begun the 40-mile or 65-kilometer march from Zoco el Arba, and almost 3 months after the beginning of the relief operation. The fighting was vicious right up until the end, with the legionaries of Franco's rearguard taking more than 500 casualties on the last day of the march. Total Spanish losses in the withdrawal were on the scale of Anwal, with estimates ranging between 18 and 20,000 lost, overwhelming majority of which were killed. The High Command was not exempt from the bloodshed, with General Serrano killed on the battlefield and Federico Berenguer badly wounded at Zogo el Arba. In exchange for this heavy toll in lives of equipment, something like 400 positions in the Comandancia were evacuated. Though this action was another terrible blow to the Spanish war effort, it served to clear away the debris of the failed Spanish strategy of the early 1920s. Despite the changes brought about by the Primo de Rivera coup, many lamentably inadequate officers remained in important positions. The conduct of the retreat, in which the army held together rather than breaking under similar pressure as it had experienced at Anwal, was noted and attributed, probably accurately, to the leadership style of the new dictator, and in the aftermath, this prestige differential would allow the Directorate to finally weed out to some extent the poor leadership that had so long saddled the regular Spanish soldier in the field. Further, the defensive network that was abandoned was a liability, both in its siting, its coverage, and its actual composition. This scattered multitude of blockhouses and fortified settlements was manifestly unsuited to controlling the territory, and its loss was a strategic gain for the Spaniards. One of the changes that would come to Spanish conduct of the war effort in the Protectorate was the implementation of a more easily held set of field bases, which would to a large extent eliminate the necessity for so many costly supply convoy missions. These had proved very costly to the Spanish, and of disproportionate value to the rebels. These many small actions were, after all, one of the chief sources of their arms and equipment, most of which were captured from the Spanish and taken off of their dead. The restriction of the rebel sources of supply would be further intensified by the erection of the Primo Line facing Tangier. This better constructed defensive line, made up of blockhouses no more than a quarter mile, or about 800 meters apart, equipped with powerful searchlights and secure behind belts of mines, was a formidable obstacle to overland smuggling of munitions from the international settlement. Though the flow of weapons and other articles of war was never cut off, the effect of the Primo Line and the stronger coastal blockade now exercised by the Navy was telling. The overall effect of the new Spanish stance in the west was to erode rebel power while drastically curtailing Spanish losses, with a consequent rise in the morale and confidence of the soldiers. Behind this line, according to the dictator's original plan, the army began the process of reorganization and reinforcement for a strong comeback on more favorable terms, which is planned for the coming spring. It can therefore be judged that while the retreat from Xiaowen was terribly costly for the Spanish, it represented a strategic victory. One further important development in the West must be examined here before we conclude this episode. This involved the warlord Raizuli, who was still weak in the wake of the evacuation of Xiaowen. The power vacuum left by the departure of the Spaniards was filled by the Riffians and their local allies, rather than by the forces of the Eagle of Janat. The Spanish wished to keep him as a puppet ruler in the area, but as his position was so weak, they urged him to move his residence from the mountains near Tazarut to one behind the fortifications in Tetuan. The proud Raizuli would never consent to this, nor would he accept the entreaties of Abdelkrim's agents, who were in no mood to tolerate a rival in the Jebala now that their power was approaching its zenith, and especially not on the heels of their occupation of the bulk of the region. Raizuli, who looked upon the Riffian leaders as overconfident upstarts, refused to entertain the Riffian offer to serve their cause or face the consequences. As a result, the Riffians determined to rid the Jebala of Raizuli once and for all. His old subordinate, Ahmed Herrero, already leading the Riffian Harkas in the region, was chosen to lead this assault. For this attack, he led a force of 1,200 Jebalis, as well as 600 members of the Beni Uruguel and Temsaman tribes, backed up by 2,500 fighters drawn from the peoples of the Gomara. 300 of the Riffians were members of the Regulars, elite men with regular European-style training and machine gun support. The assault was launched on the 23rd of January 1925. The Jebalis went in first and struck hard at the warlord's stronghold of Tazarut. Their attack stalled, however, and the Regulars and other Riffians followed up and hit Raizuli's men while they were off balance, while the Gomaris encircled the area and prevented reinforcement or rescue. The Riffians broke into the fortress and accomplished in this sharp action what the Spanish had been unable to bring about in the last 5 years of intensive effort, the capture of the warlord. His legendary supernatural protection seems finally to have failed him. He was ill, but unbroken, and refused to flee before his assailants, and was carried into captivity. He was treated with respect, and carried across the mountains in a litter to Xiaowen, and from there into the heart of the Rif at Tarquist, where he was imprisoned in a Riffian household. The old warlord had resolved not to linger in this shameful bondage, and refused food, expressing his wish to die. To his host he was recorded to have said, referring to himself in the third person, quote, "Raizuli wishes to forget this outside world. I have asked to die and want to die. Why do they not kill me at once? Raizuli will never be a prisoner and a slave to dogs in the place where he once reigned as lord. They have taken my horse and saddle. Now let them take the rest. The prophet shall receive me in heaven." In April he got his wish, and the Eagle of Janat died and was buried in a plain grave in the village of Tamasint. The Riffians were said to have found treasure valued at more than 16 million pesetas, or about 2.5 million contemporary dollars, in the wreckage of his stronghold. The warlord was little lamented by the Jebalis, who embraced the Riffian cause. With the demise of Raizuli, Abdelkrim now gained control of the bulk of the western commandancia, and reached the highest point of his power so far, with his influence extending all over the Protectorate. And so, this is where I think I'll end this episode. I hope you found some of this interesting and useful. With the drastic changes in the military situation that came in 1924, another phase of the Rif War came to an end. In 1925, right as the power and prestige of the Riffian cause and the Abdelkrim regime reached its zenith, it would face new and very formidable challenges that would give the war a different character, to eventually lead to the final campaigns in the Spanish Protectorate and southwards into the French zone. Next time we return to the Rif War, we'll take a look at these changes, which involved a reorganized and more effective Spanish army, as well as the most crucial factor in the transformation of the war, which was the intervention of the French. Next time, however, we'll return to the sunlit skies of the Pacific and resume our examination of the career of the SPD Dauntless carrier dive bomber in the Second World War. In Part 3 of this series, we'll look in detail at what were definitely this aircraft's most decisive contributions to the Pacific War, and probably the most consequential actions of shipboard aircraft in all time. I'm talking about the Battle of Midway, in which the control of the Pacific was decided in a massive showdown between the carrier fleets of Imperial Japan and the United States. We'll also look at the Dauntless' role in the carrier battles fought in the waters around the embattled island of Guadalcanal. So I hope you'll join me for that. This episode is one I've been looking forward to preparing for some time, so I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I'll enjoy producing it. So, with that said, as always, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.